to process, but the Facebook happens automatically after the live stream. Just one moment.
How long
All
is
right,
the
so
talk
we are
available on
set
Facebook?
with that. Good afternoon, everyone, for those of you on the East Coast. Today's topic is going to be a two-part series on capital punishment. And this actually comes by of a suggestion that someone who was attending the class last year had asked that we do. And I spent some time over the past year researching the topic, which was actually quite extensive. There's a lot more than I initially thought. And there is actually a fair amount that gets into some really deep questions of interpretation and how Jewish law evolves, issues that we are going to touch on a bit in this week's class, but more so in the next week. This is obviously something which is live in the sense of, and there's no pun intended there, that would be quite dark. But it's really a major issue, I think, because of questions that have come up recently. I mean, there's an ongoing issue of capital punishment in United States law, but particularly, as I mentioned in the description of today's class, having to do with the Tree of Life shooter over the summer. And so what we're going to do today is, you may have seen the source sheet is actually quite long. We're not going to go through all of it, but I did actually want to give you essentially what is a comprehensive list of laws in the Torah that for which they're the capital crimes. And that way you have this list to kind of refer to and go through and make your own analysis. But we'll touch on a few of them and we'll quickly kind of peruse our way through the that list, and then we'll make our way to some understandings of why there was capital punishment in the Torah, and then also how the rabbis interpreted some of those laws. So I'm going to share my screen. You should have received an email from me, a link to Harvard Hillel's webpage where our source sheets and videos come up, and also the source sheet was attached. You see how long it is. For those of you who are joining for the first time, I tend to present anything that's in Hebrew or Aramaic in its original, but we go through just in English. So hopefully this will be accessible, but you have the original texts if you want to refer to them. So let's go through a few of the different categories for capital crimes in the Torah. And it begins, or not necessarily chronologically in the Torah, but I think in many ways we'll start and then we'll get into more detail about murder. And so that is described in a normative sense in Exodus, in the 21st chapter there, where we read that one who fatally strikes another party shall be put to death. Quite straightforward, and probably for many of us, the least controversial of death penalty laws, even for those of us who might be fully opposed. There's probably a sense that this might make the most sense, but we're going to get into more detail there. And this is stated in a very powerful way, already going back to the early parts of the Torah in Bereshit and Genesis, which really, for the most part, are not normative, are not about law. But there we read, "For your own lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. I require a reckoning for human life, of every man that of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in God's image did God make man." And we see here in that last verse this beautiful chiastic structure, chiastic meaning CBA. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, or in the Hebrew, shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yeshafech. And so I think we see sort of two pieces here. The first is the sense that if you take a life, there's a tit for tat that's up in operation. And also the underlying reason is because human beings are made in the image of God. And there seems to be a significance there that if we somehow destroy this image of God, that then requires a kind of something to be done in its place or in compensation. One other piece that I'll also add, which we're not going to focus on, but one interesting thing that happens prior to this moment in Breshit is, of course, the first murder that takes place in the Torah, which is Cain killing Hevel, Cain killing Abel. And there, God also holds Cain accountable. But interestingly, Cain has never been warned against this. There's never been any mention that murder is itself prohibited. And that actually might very well be a way in which the Torah is saying that there are things that we can be held accountable for that aren't expressly stated in the Torah. And it's kind of a validation of what we might call natural law, that there are laws that we're meant to be able to intuit, even if they aren't stated explicitly in the Torah. And actually, if one lines up the story of Cain with the story of Adam and Eve and eating from the tree, there's a lot of linguistic parallels there. And with Adam and Eve eating from the tree, we see that actually is very clearly their violation of a command from God, and yet Cain is held accountable, and that story has a lot of parallels for something that wasn't commanded by God. So there's a way we can draw these parallels between normative statements in the Torah and conclusions that we're supposed to come to on our own, which are also normative, even though they aren't stated in the Torah as law. Again, that's not the topic for today, but I think it's an interesting side point. Okay, so murder is the first category of things that are subject to capital punishment in the Torah, and perhaps not surprisingly. And then we get into a whole subset of matters that we would call ritual, and specifically, there's a subset that has to do with idol worship. And we see in Exodus 22, whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord alone shall be prescribed. An interesting word there, v'yachram, and Rashi explains that word means shall be put to death. And this is stated in one way or another a few times in the Torah, also in Leviticus 20. Anyone among the Israelites or among the strangers residing in Israel who gives any offspring to Molech, so this was a type of idol worship in which people would sacrifice their children to this idol, such a person who does this shall be put to death. The people of all of the land of Israel shall pelt the person with stones. That's the form of the death penalty there. It's an interesting law to raise, and especially in the context of Abraham and the almost slaughter of Isaac. And of course, that's a challenging story, something we've touched on in the past. But just to say, the conclusion to that story is that God doesn't want child sacrifice, but child sacrifice wasn't uncommon in the ancient Middle East. And we see here that there's the direct prohibition against doing so, and in particular, that is also a severe crime, a capital crime. And then we have in this next source, we won't read this inside, but also a broader and more extended articulation of a capital crime for someone who worships another god. I just want to quickly go through these at the beginning, but then we'll focus on some other points later, more conceptual. In Deuteronomy, we read that if there appears among you a prophet or a dream diviner who gives you a sign or a portent saying, let us follow and worship another god, whom you have not experienced, even if the sign or portent named to you comes true, do not heed the words of that prophet or that dream diviner, a topic that we actually saw a few weeks ago in our conversation about the false prophet. And the Torah then continues on in the bold here, as for that prophet or dream diviner, such a one shall be put to death for having urged disloyalty to the Lord your God. So we see here not just worshiping a foreign god is a problem, but also causing others to do so. And then we see that not just on a leadership level, but also on a more lay level in verse 7. If your brother, your own mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your closest friend entices you in secret, saying, come, let us worship other gods, whom neither you nor your ancestors have experienced, from among the gods of the peoples around you, either near or distant, anywhere from one end of the earth to the other, do not assent or give heed to any of them, show no pity or compassion, and do not cover up the matter, but take that person's life. Let your hand be the first to put that person to death, followed by the hand of the rest of the people. And there are some details actually in that last verse there about how we carry out capital crime. We're not going to focus on that right now. But here we see also that there's worship, idol worship, and there's also enticing people to idol worship, which is considered so grave that that is a capital crime. And then again in Deuteronomy 20, a verse that we actually saw a few weeks ago, again, a prophet who speaks falsely in the name of God is also put to death. We have a dream diviner or just a diviner in Leviticus 20. And then in Leviticus 24, also someone who blasphemes God, who curses God by pronouncing the full name of God. Those people are also put to death. So this kind of concludes this subsection. But we see, so far we've seen murder, and now we've seen idol worship, enticing people to idol worship, somehow challenging God's authority by cursing God. Those are matters that are subject to the death penalty. And we may, I think so far, these might seem a bit intuitive insofar as, again, murder is perhaps the most egregious crime a person can commit. And we also saw that that's stated in the context of human beings being made in the image of God. And now also when it comes to idol worship, there's kind of a way in which, from a religious perspective, if you are completely going astray and worshiping the antithesis of the divine, then you are really getting all of life wrong in some ways, and that's considered egregious and also then subject to capital punishment. But then we have some other laws which I think may be less obvious that they should carry such a severe crime. And the first has to do with Shabbat, where we read in Exodus 35, on 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. So another capital crime is violating Shabbat, violating the Sabbath. And one other law that might come in the category of ritual, but is not directly related to avodah zarah, to worshiping foreign gods, is when the tabernacle is to set out, the Levites shall take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites shall set it up, and the outsider who encroaches shall be put to death. So if someone who's not a Levite, who's not instructed to be setting up, taking down the tabernacle and carrying it, this is the portable sanctuary throughout the desert, such a person also is put to death. So I think these two may seem a little bit extreme and surprising to us that they would carry such an egregious punishment. The next category, which we're not going to read inside, but there are many here, have to do with all of the various forbidden sexual practices, most of which have to do with incest or have to do with adultery. And here too, we may surmise this has to do with violation of certain boundaries of love, that these are relationships that are meant to be loving relationships, but non-sexual. And in order to preserve the sanctity of those relationships, it's important to set up extra strong boundaries. And when one violates them, that is seen as being sufficiently severe to require capital punishment. Again, these are here for you because I wanted to make sure that you had access to these in one place, but we're not going to go through all of them. That would certainly be too tedious. The last couple that we'll look at have to do with the treatment of one's parents. So there's an obligation that we see in Exodus 21, that one who strikes one's father or mother shall be put to death. And also 2 verses later, one who insults one's father or mother shall be put to death, who curses them. And again, we're familiar with the general notion probably of kibud av va'em, that one is required to honor their parents. And here we see that one who violates that in specific ways is also put to death. And I think what's particularly notable here, right? One is forbidden from striking any person, but if you do that to someone who's not a parent, then it's not a capital crime, even though it is still considered a punishable crime. The last one we'll take a look at here is perhaps one of the more unusual halachot or laws in the Torah, which has to do with the Ben Sora Mora, the wayward son. And this actually comes from my bar mitzvah parsha, and I think every bar mitzvah boy who has this or girl has this as their parsha loves to, refer to themselves as being a quasi-rebellious, wayward child. But there we read that if a man has a wayward and defiant son who does not heed his father or mother and does not obey them even after they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town at the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of the town, "This son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Thereupon his town's council shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid. So this is something that we could actually analyze in detail on its own and how the rabbis understood this general law. But the main point with this one is that we say that what the specific elements or behavior of this wayward son are not actually that bad, but we are punishing him on account of who he is to become in the future. So another challenging idea potentially of how we think about punishment, specifically capital punishment. So we have these various laws that fall into a handful of different categories, and we may ask ourselves, okay, so why do we have a notion of capital punishment? What is that meant to accomplish? And one approach to this comes from Rabbi Moshe Meiselman. He's actually a Harvard alum and runs a yeshiva in Jerusalem. And he explains the following in an article on the topic from 1981. He writes, "The purpose of the law enters as a factor in determining the severity of the crime. For instance, the observance of the Sabbath is the testimony by the Jewish people to the creation of the world by God. A violation of the Sabbath is a desecration of this symbolic testimony. It is for this reason that desecration of the Sabbath merits the death penalty." So in a moment, we'll get into a little bit of the details of why the Sabbath, but why capital punishment. But the main point here from Rabbi Meiselman is that when we look at different kinds of law, what we should be doing is looking at their severity, basically ranking their severity. And we can see in that rank just how significant the particular law itself is. Now, this may seem obvious to some of you, but basically the point here is that the laws themselves are meant to mirror, the severity of the laws are meant to mirror the severity of the crime. And in particular, the way that Rabbi Meiselman describes Shabbat, which for many of us might feel like, hold on a second, that might be a significant principle in Jewish practice, but is it really that severe? But for him, he's saying yes, because the Sabbath is not just the specific behaviors that one engages in on Shabbat, but is actually symbolic of something much greater, right? The testimony by the Jewish people to the creation of the world by God. And so if what we saw earlier was these notions of idol worship, of kind of defying God and really turning away from the sense of God as creator and ultimate authority, then if Shabbat is meant to be the symbolic way by which the Jewish people affirm God as the creator, then its violation may have a deep symbolic meaning, and therefore it becomes worthy of a capital crime. Now, if this strikes you as particularly harsh, well, that may also be because of the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and that many of us probably don't view Shabbat in the way that Rabbi Meiselman describes. And this, in fact, is also offered by Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who's a really fascinating rabbi in Israel. He's part of the ultra-Orthodox community, but he has done a lot to build bridges with non-Orthodox Jews. And he also has a vast series of books on Jewish law. And there he writes the following. He says, "In the past, when all Jews kept Shabbat in the traditional way, one who publicly desecrated it, even if not spitefully by their intention, was considered disaffiliated from the Jewish people. But in recent times, when many Jews do not keep Shabbat, only one who publicly desecrates Shabbat out of spite or to harm Israel's Torah is considered like an idolater. In contrast, one who desecrates Shabbat for their own convenience is not equated with one who decides to alienate themselves from their Jewish heritage." So Rabbi Melamed here is saying, which I think is in contrast to Rabbi Meiselman, is that it's true. There may have been moments in Jewish history where it was basically universally practiced that all Jews kept Shabbat. And what this then meant, and there's a slight difference between what Rabbi Melamed is saying and what Rabbi Meiselman is saying, but that would have meant that kind of to break Shabbat was, even if you weren't intentionally doing that out of spite, but essentially it was impossible to avoid there being an element of spite there because it was the default practice. And so one could argue that the way that Rabbi Meiselman describes the observance of Shabbat as being an affirmation of God as creator, well, maybe at some point in Jewish history, or for most of Jewish history, if someone didn't keep Shabbat, that would essentially be undermining that principle and kind of the antithesis of the affirmation of God, the denial of God as creator. And so too, what Rabbi Melamed also says is keeping Shabbat was a way of being part of Jewish community, and someone who didn't do that because that was the universal practice, it was an act of rebellion, an act of disaffiliating from the broader Jewish people. But in today's sociological context, it doesn't mean that at all. When someone keeps the letter of the law when it comes to Shabbat or doesn't, that may not necessarily be an affirmation of this notion of God as creator, or the denial of God as creator, or the disaffiliation from the broader Jewish people. So just to say, as it pertains to Shabbat specifically, where many of us may have found the notion of a violation of Shabbat being a capital crime to be a bit harsh, we can see its broader symbolic meaning at certain points in Jewish history, where for Rabbi Meiselman that still holds today, but for Rabbi Melamed that does not hold. And just to say, neither of these rabbis are discussing actual capital crime. Capital crime is not even on the table for these things in any community. But in terms of practical relevance, Rabbi Melamed's actually talking about whether to, say, include in a minyan someone who doesn't publicly keep Shabbat, or to call them up to the Torah. And he says you can do that because while certain points in history we wouldn't do that because of it was a sense of disaffiliating from the Jewish community. That's no longer the case in today's context. Now, Rabbi Meiselman also offers another understanding of why we have capital crimes. And he says the following. He says, punishment is neither deterrent nor rehabilitation. Two fundamental ways that we tend to think about punishment in a general context. He's saying that's not what's happening in the Torah. It is not even God's revenge. It is rather an expression of condemnation for a violation of God's law. Hence, punishment, be it flogging in simpler cases or death in the most serious case, is accompanied by a confession. The need for punishment is not society's, but in a manner of speaking, God's and man's. From this point of view, biblical law cannot serve as a model for contemporary legal systems, as the concept of personal guilt and atonement are not functioning concepts in a secular legal system. So I find this to be rather fascinating for a couple of reasons. Number one, the article that Rabbi Meiselman writes, and the excerpt that we saw before, may strike us as being somewhat harsh. At the same time, what Rabbi Meiselman is saying is that there's a fundamental difference between religious law and the way that law functions in general society. And that then creates this kind of divide between these two, which on the one hand means if you look at capital punishment in the Torah, you can't apply any of those lessons to a broader secular society. So you can't say, hey, look, the Torah over and over again, as we saw in sort of the first 4 pages of this source sheet, demands capital punishment, and therefore it's clear that the Torah supports capital punishment in American society. Rabbi Meiselman is saying is that's not the case at all, because in general society, we're thinking about punishment in terms of deterrent or rehabilitation. But in a religious context, it's actually about atonement. And atonement, of cleansing of oneself, is really a matter between a person and God. And that doesn't have any role in a secular society. But the challenge that this presents with us also, if we were to adopt this approach, is that there's no lessons that we can learn. And so the whole point, in some ways, of this class, but I think more generally for many of us, is we can look to the Torah, not just how it addresses religious concerns or in a purely religious society, but also as a way to guide us, at least on a values level, if not by a direct lessons, but on a values level of how we can live in our own lives. So I find Rabbi Meiselman in general to be quite interesting. He's also a friend of my father's when they were both in school in Boston together some 60 years ago. But in the end of the day, if we adopt his approach, there's really no more that we can say in terms of how we would apply Torah ideas around capital punishment to a broader society. On the flip side, Aaron Anker is a law professor. I think he's retired now in Israel. I think he was one of the founding faculty members of the law department at Bar Ilan. And he says, similar to Rabbi Meiselman, that we can look at the severity, the ranking of severity punishments in the Torah, and we can learn from them the ranking of severity of the laws themselves that correlate with each of the punishments. But he says a second point here, which is the second role of punishment is to promote the social goals of criminal justice, such as warning criminals, preventing the criminal from committing further crimes, etc. So he basically seems to be saying that it's true what Rabbi Meiselman says, that there's a religious element here, and that's part of what we're meant to learn from the Torah. And that means that Shabbat is a very severe, or it's a principle, it's an institution that has a lot of gravity. And certainly we can't apply that to American law. So there's one element of law in the Torah that just doesn't kind of apply beyond the religious society. But he says there's a second element too, which is also very practical and that has to do with society's goals. And on that front, what appears in the Torah also has some relevance to broader society. So these were some kind of general ideas, but I want to focus a little bit here on this question of capital punishment for murder specifically. I think that's the one that is, most debated in American society. Certainly, as far as I know, when it comes to, say, sexual sins, there's no one's talking about capital punishment in those cases, but it tends to be on questions of murder. And there's a lot written about that also in the context, in Jewish context. So first, one interesting idea that we can see comes about from how a Midrash looks at the 10 Commandments. And the Midrash there asks, how were the 10 Commandments given? And it offers the answer, 5 on one tablet and 5 on the other. It says, I am the Lord your God, which is the first of the 10 Commandments, and opposite to it, meaning number 6, is you shall not kill, whereby Scripture apprises us that spilling blood is tantamount to diminishing the likeness of the king. Right, so just to make sure we fully grasp that, you have these 5, the first 5 commandments and the second 5 commandments. 1 and 6 are paralleled, 2 and 7, 3 and 8, etc. But because 1 and 6 are physically juxtaposed to each other, we see here that the commandment of I am the Lord your God is juxtaposed to the prohibition from killing. And we learn from this, right, that it's tantamount to diminishing the likeness of the king, meaning God. And the Midrash then makes an analogy. A king of flesh and blood enters a province, sets up statues of himself, makes images of himself, and mints coins in his likeness. After some time, they upset his statues, break his images, devalue his coins, and diminish the likeness of the king, meaning people out there do this. Likewise, Scripture equates spilling blood to diminishing the likeness of the king, as it is written, one who spills the blood of man, as we saw before, and continues for the image of God did he, meaning God, make man. So we saw this in the verse itself in Genesis, but it's I think elaborate on a bit here in this Midrash in a beautiful and powerful way to basically say that when a person kills another person, it is as if they are diminishing God in the world. And that's why this is such a severe crime. Now, what's interesting about this to me is we can read it in 2 different ways. On the one hand, we can say, okay, if this is such a severe act, that human beings have this value to be the image of God, which is the presence of God really in the world, such that killing a person is diminishing God in the world, then we understand it's so severe that the crime should be very high. At the same time, one's being made in the likeness of God is maintained even if they themselves have committed a serious crime, which means a murderer themselves is still understood to be in the likeness of God. And so when we kill that person, we're actually further diminishing the likeness of God in the world. So I think there's actually two sides to this particular coin. And if you think that you can extinguish your own likeness of God in the world, that's not true. In fact, after there is capital punishment and someone is killed, we have to bury them. We can't leave them hanging. And the reason for that is because it's as if the image of God is itself being hanged. And so even means when a person has already died and a person is considered a criminal subject to capital crime, capital punishment, they are still considered to be in the image of God. That's how powerful that notion is. Okay, so we see here again two potential ways we might read that midrash, but in a fundamental level, we're seeing that murder is of the highest order of crimes because we are all made in the image of God. So I want to now look to some more rabbinic interpretations of how capital crimes were adjudicated, or the process that they were dealt with in the courts. And this is now going to open up a broader question, which will also continue a bit next week, which has to do with the relationship between how things are described in the Torah and then how the rabbis interpret them later on. And that's a much broader issue, which extends beyond just capital punishment, which I think actually makes this subject not just intriguing on how we think about capital crimes, but also how we think about how Jews interpret text, which is really important. So the Tractate of Sanhedrin deals with a lot of court cases, and in the 4th chapter deals with how we deal with witnesses when they come to testify against someone. And in the bolded part here, we read how the courts talk to the witnesses when they come, kind of how they warn them about the severity of their role as being a witness. And they say the following. They say, "Know that capital cases are not like monetary ones." This is the court saying this to a witness who's coming to testify in a capital case. "In monetary cases, a false witness can return the money and achieve atonement." Right? So if I come and I testify that Joe owes Sarah $1,000 and it's not true, and because of my testimony, Joe ends up paying Sarah $1,000, well, I can always make that up. Of course, it's a problem, but money's fungible, and you can kind of reverse that process. But in capital cases, the blood of the victim and all of their future offspring hang upon you until the end of time. Right? So we see a couple of things here. The first is that if someone gets killed on behalf of a false testimony, that's irreversible. But not only are you killing that individual, but you're actually extinguishing all of their potential descendants. And we learn this out from actually not just logically, but also the story of Cain. "For thus we find in regard to Cain, who killed his brother," where the verse there says, "the bloods," in plural, "of your brother scream out." The verse does not say blood of your brother, but bloods of your brother, because it was his blood and also the blood of his future offspring that were screaming out. The judge's speech continues. "It was for this reason that man was first created as one person, as Adam, to teach you that anyone who destroys a life is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world. And anyone who saves a life is as if he saved an entire world." So you might be familiar with this. This is a common text which is cited. But the notion in one way is that each person is of infinite value. And as a result, if you take someone's life, you're destroying an infinite universe. But in this context, it seems to also be saying that it's about their descendants, right? Because had Adam been killed, there would have never been any of us. Human beings would not have been around. So someone who had killed Adam also is responsible for having taken all of their descendants, which is not quite infinite, but a vast, vast number. And that applies to killing anyone. So at this moment, we see that the judges, as they are warning the witnesses, are really, I think, instilling a whole lot of fear in them, right? I'm coming to testify against this person, and now I'm being warned that if I get it wrong, look at the consequences of that. And you might think that this actually would be terrifying for anyone who's going to be a potential witness, such that it might disincentivize them from ever actually coming to testify in a capital case, because why would I do so when the stakes are so high? But of course, we do need people to testify in such cases. And so the judge continues and says, maybe you, meaning the witnesses, will now say, what do we need this and all this anxiety? For let's not come forward even with true testimony, right? Everything you just told me was about false testimony, but now that I see the stakes are so high, even if I know what I saw and I'm going to testify honestly, I don't want to deal with that. That's too much of a burden to bear. But Scripture has already spoken and says, if he be a witness, having seen or known, if he does not express, meaning what he knows, he shall bear his sin. Maybe you will now say, what do we need this to be responsible for another man's death? But Scripture has already spoken, when the wicked are destroyed, there is rejoicing. And so we see already in this Midrash, in this Mishnah, the two sides to the coin here. On the one hand, we need the witnesses to take this exceedingly seriously. And that, I think, gives us some kind of pause or hesitation with capital crimes altogether, because if you get it wrong, then the consequences are dire. And this is a separate consideration, I think, than the notion of should we actually be killing someone who's deserving of it? And in that case, we see in the second half that yes, the answer is certainly true, and therefore we need the courts to actually function properly, because as the verse in Proverbs says, when the wicked are destroyed, there is rejoicing. Which means that we want or expect that someone who is in fact guilty of a capital crime should be put to death, but we are extremely cautious of convicting someone who is actually innocent. And that, at least on a practical plane, I think becomes a real challenge, right? Because on the theoretical level, we're basically saying we should carry out capital crimes, but we're also seeing on a practical level, if there seems to be any doubt and you get it wrong, those consequences are basically infinite. And I like this Midrash in particular because it's starting to get into the nitty-gritty of the practical elements here. But you also sort of see within kind of one speech that a judge is giving the sense of gravity and but also the sense of necessity for carrying out these crimes. Oh, sorry, these punishments for these crimes. Now, the Rambam talks about this in his Mishnah Torah, which also tries to convey the sense of that the courts really do have an obligation to make sure that when there is a capital crime, the person is actually put to death, and that is a serious matter. And so the Rambam says the court is warned not to take a ransom for the murderer, even if they give all the money in the world, and even if the redeemer of blood wishes to exempt them, right? This actually means that the relatives of the person who has been killed, if they come forward and say, I don't want the death penalty in this case, which, by the way, we see all the time, that especially with religious Christians, that when there have been some heinous acts, they come forward and say, their relatives do, and say, we ultimately want to forgive this person, and we don't want them to be put to death. But here, the Rambam is saying is that it's not up to them. The law demands the death penalty, and that the courts, whether that's in some kind of formal bribe or just the sense that someone could pay money such that it goes to the benefit of society, that actually cannot be taken. The person needs to be put to death. And the Rambam continues, for the life of this person who is killed is not the possession of the Redeemer of blood, meaning their relatives, but rather the possession of the Holy One, blessed be he. As it says, do not take a ransom for the life of a murderer. And there is nothing that the Torah is more exacting about than bloodshed. As it says, you shall not pollute the land, for blood pollutes the land. And we see here, right, this sense that if a person's life is taken, if someone is murdered, and we saw before this is diminishing of God in the world, their blood somehow, meaning their innocent life which was taken, is seen as polluting the land, polluting society, and therefore we need to make sure that the courts are actually in place and effective at carrying out capital crimes or capital punishment for someone who has committed this crime. Okay. So we've seen here, it seems like the general thrust of the text that we've seen so far is that we do want to carry out capital punishment, but we also have to be cautious that it happens in the appropriate way, such that someone is never convicted who themselves is innocent. But a famous Mishnah in Makot, which is often quoted, actually presents on a more theoretical plane some hesitation at carrying out capital punishment. And we read there, a Sanhedrin, a court, that would execute somebody once in 7 years would be considered destructive. The destructive here really means like violent, would be a kind of ruthless court. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, even if it's once in 70 years, right, a court that carries out capital punishment once in 70 years is basically considered a vicious court. Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva said, if we were on the Sanhedrin, nobody would have ever been executed. So let's understand what's going on here before we see the last line in the Mishnah. There seems to be a sense, right, that in as much as, right, you look through all of the laws that we saw at the beginning of today's class, and it seems like there would be capital punishments taking place all the time in ancient Israel. Nevertheless, we see that a court that kills someone once in every 7 years would be considered particularly vicious court. And according to some, even a court that carries out capital punishment every 70 years would be considered vicious. And those seem to be, I think, rather surprising. And we may ask the question, hold on a second, if there are all these laws that are subject to capital crimes, how could this be the case? It should be that, you know, whenever these cases arose, they would be carried out. That's what Maimonides seems to be saying, that it's upon the court to carry out these punishments. So one way to explain this might be to say that really the general purpose of the Torah is to warn people. These are such severe crimes. And if they're effective, then actually courts would never really have to carry out capital punishment because people would be too afraid to violate these crimes. So that would be one way to understand this Mishnah. But once we get to Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, we begin to, I think, get a little bit confused because they're saying that if we were on the Sanhedrin, no one would have ever been executed. You know, what can that possibly mean? How would they have had the authority to not execute people? As we've seen, Maimonides said, it's upon the courts to carry out these cases. So we'll actually discuss more of that, I think, in more detail next week. But it seems as if the Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva have some mechanisms for making sure that capital punishments don't actually come to fruition. Now, many people only quote up until this point in the Mishnah, and this is true across the board. Orthodox rabbis, Reform rabbis, right? This is often an argument that people make to say that really Judaism is opposed to capital punishment. And yet, the conclusion of this Mishnah is a real critique of Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, they too would have increased violence in Israel. What does this mean? It means that if Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva were to come along and find ways to get criminals who committed murder off so that they themselves wouldn't actually be killed by the courts, well, what's the effect of that going to be? The effect of that's going to be that murderers will be walking free and can go ahead and commit more crimes. And also, it seems potentially that you've lost this deterrent factor. And that will mean that people will be less deterred from committing capital crimes, and they'll go ahead and be killing. Murder would rise within society. So just to point out, there's a major dispute that's taking place in this Mishnah. It's important to note, as I said, lots of people don't share the final statement from Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, but the Mishnah itself contains this deep theoretical divide between two camps, the Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva camp, and the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel camp, about how important it is to make sure that capital punishment is taking place within society. So the Gemara, and right, the Gemara is the analysis of later generations of rabbis of the Mishnah, the Code of Jewish Law, comments on Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, and says Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva said, if we were part of the court, etc., what we just saw, and the Gemara asks, what will they have done? Meaning, how exactly would they have found ways to make sure that people wouldn't be killed as part of be executed as part of capital punishment? And they would have done the following. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Eliezer said together, they would ask the witnesses, did you see if the victim was a treifa or inviolable? A treifa is someone who's going to die within 12 months. And technically, they're sort of considered quasi-dead. So if you kill someone who is going to die anyway, you're not held accountable for their murder because they were going to die within a year anyway. So they first asked this question. You're witnesses, you saw someone kill someone, but was that person really a fully viable human being? Because if not, the murderer is not truly a murderer. Rav Ashi says, if it came out that they said that they saw that the victim was viable prior to being killed, they would say that maybe in the exact place that the sword entered, there was a hole. Right? This basically, they're trying to come up with all kinds of fanciful arguments to say that what you saw that you thought was murder, maybe it actually wasn't murder and the person died some other way, right? So you saw someone stab someone, but actually they had a hole in that exact spot from some other injury, and therefore the stabbing that you saw wasn't the cause of their death. So this, right, I mean, this seems like the arguments being made here are kind of some almost a caricature of maybe say Johnny Cochran in the O.J. Simpson case, about basically saying something which seems really implausible, but maybe we can say there's a tiny, tiny chance that this was actually true, and therefore we have to throw out the case and we can't hold this criminal accountable. We're going to get into more detail about this in next week's class, but just to say, we are now seeing a kind of set of loopholes that are allowing that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are employing to get someone off of capital crime. For those of you who are interested in loopholes, by the way, we have a program coming up in 2 weeks as part of our online speaker series with Alana Stein-Hain, who's a phenomenal scholar for the Hartman Institute, and she just published her dissertation on rabbinic loopholes, and she'll be in conversation with Rabbi Ethan Tucker and Jonathan Gould, who is a law professor at Berkeley who wrote about loopholes in secular law. So we're going to touch on this a little more next week, but also in a more detailed analysis, you can come to Alana's class on April 15th at 7 p.m. But the final point here that I want to emphasize for today's class, because we'll get into more of the details in next week's class, but is this notion that if Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon were in fact successful in employing their methodology of getting people who probably actually committed the murder not killed, well, as we saw, that's just going to mean that there'll be greater proliferation of murder in ancient Israel. And that itself seems like a problem. So if that's the case, was there any kind of compromise? Was there any kind of middle ground here that the rabbis could employ? Because the Torah says you should kill someone. So presumably there's a binary. You bring someone to trial, and either you find them guilty and you kill them, or you don't because you interrogate the witnesses in the way that the Talmud describes, and then the person is found innocent and they kind of move on in life. So what actually then, was there any other options the rabbis had? And the Rambam describes an interesting approach. He says the following. He says, this is Maimonides, one who takes a life, and the witnesses did not see them as one, but rather they saw them one from behind the other, or they killed before witnesses without being warned. That's also another element to this, which we'll get into more detail, is that for someone to be held accountable for murder, they have to have been warned just before they committed the murder that they're not allowed to do that. Or the witnesses contradict one another in trivial details, but not in the essentials. All of these cases, the murderer is placed in an enclosed space and force-fed dry bread and water until their guts hurt, and they feed them barley until their stomachs rupture from the weight of the sickness. So what is Maimonides describing here? He's saying that it's true. There are all these technicalities by which a person could be found innocent in a capital case. And as we've seen before, especially if we employ the tactics of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Eliezer, but we don't want people just walking around who we're pretty certain are murderers. So what do? He says there's this other way that we can still essentially kill them, but not directly, because we're force feeding them, and that's an indirect form of killing. Now, Maimonides elaborates on this, and he says, one does not do this matter in the remainder of instances where the death penalty can be imposed by the court, but only if one is liable for execution, they should execute him, and if one is not liable for execution, they should free him. Even though there are transgressions that are weightier than the spilling of blood, they are not as corrupting as society as the spilling of blood, even idolatry. And it does not need to be said, forbidden sexual relations or the desecration of the Sabbath are not like the spilling of blood. These transgressions are offenses between a person and God, but the spilling of blood is an offense between people. And everyone who has in his hand this sin, see, he is completely evil, and all the commandments that one has done in his lifetime cannot balance against this sin and will not save him from judgment. As it is said, a person weighed down with the blood of life, etc. So what Maimonides here is saying is the ultimate conclusion is that for someone who transgresses a capital crime, of all the ones that we've seen in the Torah so far, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. For all of these cases where a person, let's say, violates Shabbat or violates Avodah Zarah, idol worship, or assaults their parents, right? In those cases, we are basically, there are all these technicalities by which a person may actually get off and be found innocent and won't be held accountable and won't be killed. And there's one exception, which is murder. So a murderer who kills, and now for technical reasons is not actually going to be liable to execution, we still find a way to actually execute them. So if we follow Maimonides, at the end of the day, we end up being in a situation where essentially there's no capital punishment except for killing a person, which to me is rather intriguing because as I start off by saying, I think for many of us, the only real debate in our minds about whether or not capital crimes should take place, let's say in American society, is probably for murder and maybe even only certain egregious forms of murder. And Maimonides comes to a very similar conclusion. And that basically means that it's true. We can follow Rabbi Moshe Meiselman in the sense that the punishments laid out in the Torah are meant to convey the seriousness of these crimes. And for various reasons, Shabbat and idol worship and how we honor our parents, those are things that are considered very severe. But on a practical level, people will get off on those and they won't actually be held won't be executed for them. But we want to be extra cautious that when it comes to a murderer, we're not going to allow such a person to walk free because that is such an egregious crime. And also, as that second half of the Mishnah says, right, that itself can also increase violence within Israel. And so for not enacting capital punishment on a murderer, that could actually lead in a kind of a utilitarian way to greater death and more innocent death in society. So that's really where we'll pause today, with sort of that conclusion. There's a lot of capital crimes listed in the Torah. For the most part, the rabbis seem to hedge against them to find ways to make sure that those cases are not fully carried out, but with a serious pushing back when it comes to murder. In next week's class, we're going to go into some more details of kind of how those loopholes are employed. And I think they'll actually get us into some really intriguing questions about interpretation, how we look at texts in the Torah and see how the rabbis went ahead and interpreted them in ways which may depart in some significant ways from what might be the more plain meaning of the text. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now so people who don't want to be on, stop recording. People who don't want to be on camera can feel comfortable asking questions.